gender is always part of our lives. It's part of who we are. It's part of the symbolic kind of artistic world that we move in, the ideological world. It structures our organizations and institutions. It helps us understand who is where in a particular moment, when the winds come, when the fire comes, who's doing what and how and where, how we feel about it, how our bodies might respond differently, the different kind of cultural norms and understandings we have. So it's really important to say at the outset, it's never, ever irrelevant, because it's always part of us and who we are.
Gender matters in disaster because women and men have different levels of risk tolerance. So gendered norms in society, those really embedded everyday occurrences that we hardly ever question, are incredibly gendered, and this is historically and it's culturally. We are cultured into acting in certain ways, and when it comes to disaster preparedness, response and recovery, we find that gendered norms in the everyday impact on how women and men prepare, engage with risk, and also how exposed they are to the various consequences.
My impressions of how decisions are made at times of disaster on a micro or macro scale, so for a major natural disaster or a household in the urban environment, pretty much centres around the fact that it's the man or the male in a family or in a couple relationship, say for instance, who would make most of these decisions leading up to and at the time of the disaster, the incident. So the decision to go or the decision to stay would generally be made by the male, or if it's made by a female, there's a good chance that it's going to be overridden by the male based on what their expectations are, their views of masculinity, their role within the family at times when there's not a disaster, when there's not an incident. So I think it's fairly self-evident that based on the stats and the way that people perish, whether or not hold another argument about how messages are received as far as to stay and defend or to leave, but I would suggest that men are the main decision makers when it comes to staying or going. In 2009 at Black Saturday, and from my knowledge, the figures much skewed by the way of men dying and perishing, which would have meant that they either left late or didn't leave at all, because there was an expectation that they should stay and defend their property, because that's what we do. We do as men, we take the heroic route, which doesn't necessarily always translate that way, and in a lot of circumstances would actually put the family, if not the individual, in harm's way.
Gender is also important in emergency management because even when policy appears gender aware, we know that the predominant norms in society are more often than not reproduced by organisations, institutions like emergency services. They're more often reproduced than they're challenged, and that means that the very embedded prejudices and inequalities that we have in society that are gendered are reproduced within organisations, even though it might be unconscious on behalf of the people who are creating these scenarios where inequalities are part and parcel of everyday policy and procedure.
Fortunate to have a privileged job, but that privileged job comes with one detractor, and I think that's the fact that it is male dominated and that there's a fairly low gender mix. So in my fire service, the fire service I work for, the MFB, we only have 64 female firefighters out of 1,800 or so.
One of the most important things about the emergency services sector, it's been dominated by males, and we need to get diversity, not only in a gender sense, but also an age profile sense. So we've got to actually take time to understand what we want to be. And I think that's really important to get the blend, the mix, the diversity, but the involvement of people. And we've got to make sure the door's open for everyone to come through, and in particular, females. I
think a greater gender mix would reflect the community that we serve or that we work for. We're public servants, basically. I think that I've been subjected to, not personally, but members of my family and friendship groups certainly have been subjected to sexism and gender bias in the past. And I think that I'm well placed within my role in the MFB to sort of chip away in our organisation and try to enact some organisational change to make us an employer of choice and a public service that is laudable in the scheme of things.
When we say promote gender equity, one, we've got to focus on it, but we need to make sure it's built to be sustainable. That it's not something we are, the next 12 months is about gender. It's got to be ongoing. It's got to be what we do in 5 months, in 5 years, in 15 years. It can't be just a program to say, 2014 is the program. It's not about that. It's got to be long term. It's got to be valuing people's contribution. That is the true contribution of what they give. So it's actually showing true respect, valuing people's contribution capabilities. And we're all different. We've all got something different to give. And I think that's the important thing, that we value what that contribution is and we get the best out of it, but it's got to be the personal experience that's a good experience. It's no good that I contribute and I don't feel as if I'm respected, I'm understood and I'm valued. It's important that I am respected, understood and valued, and I'll contribute to the broader team in a valued way, which is really important.
To be honest, if you don't do something about being more inclusive of women and men and women from ethnic sections of the Australian society that don't traditionally join your organisation, you've got a team that is withering. Because there are other organisations such as mine, the Army, or other organisations such as banks or mining organisations who have started to make serious, tangible progress in being more inclusive in a diverse sense, in a gender diversity sense. And so whatever your desired legacy is, you're not going to deliver it.
Got to make sure we've got policy and practice, we've got training, we're using exercising to encourage people, we're using true utilisation of people's capabilities. So we utilise the people for what they are, and in particular focus on getting more females involved in what is a great sector and represent what the community expects us to do.
What's in it for men is very much about when we have more equal organisations, when we have more equal societies. All the research shows that that's when everyone flourishes. So men do better, women do better, our children do better. That's what's in it for men. And, most men don't sit in isolation to women. Where it's not a zero-sum game where women win and men lose. This is very much about advancing everyone. And I think most men really understand that.
And so I think within the last 5 years, we've seen big changes in Australia in emergency management, just in terms of acknowledging that we've got an issue on our hands when it comes to gender norms, gendered structures, gendered inequality, both within the services but also in the everyday environments where we deal with householders who we are either protecting or dictating to what they should do.